Something was wrong before anyone could name it. The road had disappeared 20 minutes back, swallowed whole by a white that moved and shifted like something alive, and the two people inside that truck had stopped talking the way people do when the world outside demands all the quiet you have left. The call had come in just before dusk, a pair of hikers, shaken and breathless, reporting two injured wildcats pressed together on the shoulder of a logging road north of the valley. Lynxes, they'd said, maybe bobcats. Hard to tell, hard to see anything out there. The storm had rolled in fast off the ridge, the kind that didn't announce itself, didn't give you time to prepare. By the time the rescue truck turned off the main highway and onto the forest access road, the pines were bending in long, slow arcs, and the headlights were doing little more than lighting the snow as it came. Dana kept both hands on the wheel and said nothing. Beside her, Marcus held a thermal blanket folded in his lap and watched the tree line for shapes. They had done this before, not this exact road, not this exact storm, but the feeling was familiar. The feeling of arriving maybe too late and choosing not to say so out loud. The trees thickened. The wind pushed against the truck in long, low pulses. Somewhere above them a branch gave way and fell without a sound they could hear over the weather. Marcus pressed his face toward the window and squinted into the white. "There," he said. She stopped the truck. It took a moment to understand what they were looking at. Two shapes, low to the ground, tucked into a natural hollow where a pine's roots had lifted the snow and carved a small shelter no bigger than a bathtub. They were pressed together, one curled tightly around the other in a posture that in the sweep of the headlights looked like protection, or grief. From where they sat, it was impossible to tell if either was still breathing. Marcus was out of the truck before the engine fully settled. Dana followed, pulling the blankets and the small field kit from the back seat, her boots sinking past the ankle with every step. The cold hit the way cold does when it means it, not sharp but total, filling the lungs and making the eyes water and blur. He crouched first, reached out two fingers and held them near the smaller shape, pulled his hand back, held it near the other. "Both alive," he said. The words came out steady, but she heard what was underneath them. They were bobcats, not lynxes, as the hikers had reported, but the distinction didn't matter now. What mattered was how small they were, how still. The larger one, a female by the look of her, had her body wrapped around the smaller in a way that seemed almost deliberate, almost willed, as though even in her own collapse she had organized herself around something else entirely. Her fur was matted with ice. Her paws, when Marcus gently lifted one, were pale at the tips, frostbite already working its quiet damage. She did not struggle when he wrapped her in the blanket. She shivered, a faint full-body tremor that told them she was fighting, even if the fight had slowed to something barely visible. The younger cat, the smaller one, was in no better shape, ribs showing beneath thin fur, eyes half closed, breathing in shallow pulls that made Dana count each one quietly to herself as she carried her to the truck. They worked without rushing, which is the only way to work when rushing could finish what the storm had started. Blankets, warmth from their own hands, careful placement in the padded carriers they kept strapped behind the seats. The female resisted only once, when Marcus tried to separate her from her companion long enough to assess her legs. A low sound came from somewhere deep in her chest, not a growl exactly, something older and quieter than a growl. He stopped, let her settle, tried again more slowly, and she allowed it, though she pressed her nose toward the second carrier the entire time, as though keeping track. The truck turned around on the narrow road with difficulty. Dana drove without speaking. The storm had not eased, if anything it had grown more decided, and the headlights still drowned in white 50 feet ahead. Marcus sat in the back, one hand resting on the top of the female's carrier, feeling through the grate for the warmth of her. That was when he noticed it. She had been restless since they loaded her. He had attributed it to stress, to fear, to the disorientation of capture. But this was different. Her sides were moving in a pattern that had nothing to do with breathing. A slow, deliberate heave, a pause. Then again, her eyes, when he brought his face close to the carrier door, were focused on something he could not see. Interior, intent, turned inward in a way that made the hair on his arms rise slowly beneath his jacket. He sat back and stared at the carrier for a long moment. Then he said her name, not her real name. She didn't have one yet, but the word that came out of him anyway, low and careful in the dark cab of that truck rolling through the blizzard. "Dana," he said, "she's in labor." The truck did not speed up. Dana had been driving in blizzards long enough to know that speed would not help them now. But something changed in the silence. A shift, a weight, as both of them understood at once what they had almost driven past. What had looked like one animal sheltering another had been something else entirely, something older, something that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with it at the same time. She had not been protecting a companion in that hollow. She had been protecting what was coming next. The wildlife center was 40 minutes away. It felt longer. Marcus kept his hand near the carrier the entire drive, not touching, just present, close enough that she could sense warmth if warmth was something she could still register. Mara, he had started calling her in his head, though he couldn't have explained why. It was the sound of her breathing maybe, the way it came in slow measures, deliberate and effortful, like someone climbing a long staircase, one careful step at a time. The center's night team was waiting at the door when they pulled in. No sirens, no urgency in the loud sense, just people who understood that the worst thing you could bring into a room with a wild animal in crisis was panic. Heated pads were already laid out, IV lines prepared. The overhead lights had been dimmed to something gentler, and the air inside smelled of cedar shavings and the particular stillness of a place built around patience. They moved Mara to the prepared enclosure first. She allowed it, barely. Her contractions had grown closer together during the final stretch of road, and by the time they settled her onto the warmed bedding she had already turned inward in the way that animals do, that ancient withdrawal where the outside world becomes secondary to the one task that cannot wait. The younger bobcat was placed in an adjoining enclosure. He pressed himself immediately against the shared partition, nose working the gaps in the wire, a low continuous sound coming from his throat, not distress exactly, but something close to vigil. The team stood back. There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over a room when humans understand they are no longer the most important thing in it. Someone whispered something. Someone else placed a hand briefly on Marcus's shoulder. Dana stood at the edge of the light and watched. The first kitten arrived just after midnight, barely the size of a closed fist, wet, trembling, impossibly small against the straw. Mara turned to it with a sureness that had nothing to do with the condition she was in. The second came minutes later, then the third. No one moved, no one spoke. 3 kittens, each breathing, each alive in a room that 3 hours earlier had no reason to expect them. Dana looked at Marcus. He was already looking at her. Neither of them smiled. Exactly, it was too large for smiling. It was the kind of moment that settles into you quietly, the kind you carry home without meaning to, and find again later, unexpectedly, when you least need to cry and do anyway. She had been seconds from the end of everything. Instead, she had brought 3 new beginnings into the world. Weeks have a different texture in a wildlife rehabilitation center. They don't pass so much as accumulate, layer by quiet layer, measured not in calendar pages but in small progressions. The first time a kitten opens its eyes, the first time Mara stands fully upright without favoring her frostbitten paws, the first time the young male eats without pausing to check on her first. The staff started calling them the Snow family, without anyone deciding to. It simply became the name, the way names do when something earns them. Mara's 3 kittens grew with a speed that felt almost aggressive after those first fragile days. 2 females and a male, each with their own temperament already evident by the 4th week. The larger female was bold, perpetually first to the food, first to climb, first to swat at anything that moved. The smaller female was watchful, precise, the kind of animal that studies a situation fully before committing to it. The male kitten was somewhere in between, oscillating between his sisters like he hadn't yet decided which way to lean. Mara managed all 3 with an authority that required almost no force, a low sound here, a firm nudge there, her presence itself functioning as the boundary. The caretakers documented everything, but they also quietly just watched. There was something in Mara's gaze that the staff talked about in the break room, in the parking lot after shifts, in the way people discuss things that are real but difficult to phrase. When she looked at the humans who had helped her, it wasn't the dull resignation of an animal habituated to captivity, nor the hard wariness of one who had never learned to tolerate proximity. It was something more specific, a recognition without dependency, as though she understood the terms of what had happened between them and had accepted those terms, without confusion about where they ended. She was not theirs. She had never been theirs. But for this season, in this place, she had allowed them to stand near something that mattered, and that in its own way was its own form of trust. As spring began pressing against the windows, first as light, then as smell, then as sound, the team began the careful, bittersweet work of preparation. A larger naturalized enclosure, reduced human contact, food placed without presence, the deliberate, loving withdrawal that good rehabilitation requires. The Snow family was going home. They just didn't know yet that home was bigger than any of them, humans included, had walls to contain. Spring in the northern pine corridor doesn't arrive gently. It arrives the way something long suppressed finally releases, all at once with a smell like cold earth and moving water, like the forest exhaling after months of held breath. The same trees that had stood silent and waited with snow now ran with meltwater along their bark. The same road that had nearly swallowed Mara and her unborn kittens was now soft with mud and edged with the first pale green of returning undergrowth. The rescue truck made the drive in the opposite direction this time. They stopped at a ridge where the tree line opened briefly onto a long view of the valley below, endless layered green dissolving into morning haze, the kind of landscape that makes human problems feel appropriately small. The team worked quietly, setting the carriers down in the tall grass at the forest's edge, unlatching the doors without ceremony. There were no speeches, nobody had prepared words, because the right words for a moment like this don't exist, and the people in that field knew it. Mara came out first. She paused at the carrier's threshold for a long moment, not with hesitation, but with the particular stillness of an animal recalibrating. Her nose lifted, reading the air in rapid invisible sentences. Then she stepped into the grass, turned once and looked back. Not at the carriers, not at the truck, at the people standing 20 feet behind her, still and quiet as the trees. It lasted only a second, maybe less. Then her kittens spilled out behind her. The bold female first, of course, then the watchful one, then the young male, and the young male companion followed last, stepping into the light as though he had simply been waiting for his cue. Together, without a signal anyone could see, they moved toward the tree line. Their spotted coats caught the dappled morning light, and then dissolved into it, the forest receiving them the way it receives everything that belongs to it, completely, without ceremony, without looking back. The rescuers stood in the field until the grass stopped moving. 6 weeks later, a motion-triggered camera mounted to a pine on the valley floor captured 11 seconds of footage. Mara, moving through fresh snowmelt at the edge of a creek, her 3 kittens behind her, larger now, sure-footed, their movements beginning to carry the fluid confidence of animals coming into themselves. She pauses in the frame, ears forward, alert to something beyond the camera's reach. Then she moves on, and her young follow, and the frame goes still. The team watched the footage together late on a Thursday night, gathered around a small monitor in the break room. Nobody said much. The smiles were soft, the kind that sit quietly on a face without needing an audience. She had been rescued once, pulled from a storm that should have been her ending, but what she had truly needed was never rescue at all. It was time. It was warmth enough to begin again. It was the chance to lead something of her own back into the world she had nearly left. And she had done exactly that.